Hey YouTube, so today for episode 2 of Controller Chaos, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. It's not per se a controller that I'm looking at, but an adapter for a controller. So this right here is the Randnet Technologies Nintendo 64 or Gamecube controller to Nintendo 64 controller. And basically what this does, in theory, is that it lets you plug a Gamecube controller into this port right here, and then plug this into a Nintendo 64, and that'll let you play Gamecube games on, Nintendo 64 games with a Gamecube controller, which would be perfect because if you're like me and you really hate the original Nintendo 64 controller design, like this one I have right here. And this is a Yobo Nintendo 64 controller. This is just not a comfortable controller to play with. I've always felt like the Nintendo 64 controller is just too big and too awkward. It's like a spaceship, but a crappy spaceship. So I'm using the Yobo controller because this is the one that I have hooked up to my Nintendo 64 console currently. This is the first one I had available, and this is also actually my preferred Nintendo 64 controller. So in theory this would get rid of my problem with the Nintendo 64, and that being its controller in theory, but there's a couple problems with this. I'll get into that when I get into gameplay, but rest assured this does work. If you plug this into your Nintendo 64 with a GameCube controller, it will work. But I'm going to go into gameplay and then just kind of explain some of the issues you may have with this, alright? So I'll see you guys on the other side with gameplay. Alright, so the first game that I decided to test out using the Randnet Nintendo 64 to GameCube controller converter was Super Mario 64, and as you can tell from the footage, I'm having no issues jumping, long jumping. Now, the big thing that I was wondering was about camera control, how it would work with the C-stick, and as you can tell from the footage, I'm able to control the camera perfectly fine. I'm able to long jump and everything. All in all, everything feels very natural. It almost feels like Super Mario 64 was built from the ground up with a GameCube controller. Pretty soon here you see I jump into the moat and I start swimming around. And that was just to see how well swimming control would feel with Super Mario 64. So, Super Mario 64, as you can tell, controls perfectly fine. In fact, it feels a little bit better with a GameCube controller, a lot better with a GameCube controller than it does a Nintendo 64 controller. However, there are some drawbacks that I'm going to be getting into very soon about this about this peripheral. So as you can see right here, I'm in the moat and I'm swimming around. Everything feels, for the most part, very well. The water heals you and everything like that. So everything feels good. So Super Mario 64 definitely feels better with a GameCube controller than it does with a Nintendo 64 controller. So moving on to the next game. So next up, I decided to test out Star Fox 64, and I chose Star Fox 64 because it's a game that supports the Rumble Pack, and I was wondering with this device if it would pick up Rumble, and it doesn't. So this is the first drawback. It doesn't support Rumble, which also means that it doesn't support the Nintendo 64 memory card. So if you have either a Rumble Pack or a memory card, you're kind of, like for instance, like Quest 64, you won't be able to save on. So stuff like that is definitely a big drawback for this thing, that there's no Rumble support and or no save feature. So if you have a game that doesn't save on the cart, man, you can tell from this footage I have not played Star Fox 64 in a minute. But yeah, so if you have a game that saves, or if it's a game that doesn't, that you would like to play with Rumble, that's not going to work here. It's not supported by the controller. And I think right here is where Falco dies. Because, man, it has been a very long time since I've played some Star Fox 64. In fact, actually, this was the first time that I played the game in a couple months, because I needed to capture footage for it, which is why this is the first stage, by the way. So then moving on to the third and final game here, I chose Force Gemini, and I chose Force Gemini because it has a very particular control scheme that almost... This game was pretty much made to be played with a Nintendo 64 controller. And I realized that while I was playing it. And this was the thing that I realized. A lot of Nintendo 64 games are made with a Nintendo 64 controller in mind. Not saying that they're bad because of that. I'm just saying that if you're going to pick up this controller adapter, it's almost... There's a lot of Nintendo 64 games that you're going to have to say, okay, I don't want to play this with a Gamecube controller. So that is a very big drawback for this. As you can tell from the footage, I am just getting destroyed by enemies in Force Gemini. And, you know, everything works and everything like that, but it's just very awkward. You have to use the Z button to aim in this game, or to shoot in this game, and then the R button to aim, and that just doesn't feel comfortable at all. Once again, this is a game that was made with the Nintendo 64 controller in mind, and that is a definite drawback. And when you consider that there's actually a lot of games like that on the Nintendo 64, it pretty much holds back the Randnet technology Nintendo 64 controller adapter. But yeah, so I'm gonna go back into some on-screen footage, and I'm just going to give some closing remarks, whether or not I feel like you should buy this, or whether or not you should just skip out on this. So the next time you guys will see me, I'll be talking about the Randnet technology. I'm going to let this footage just finish out, even though it is really crappy footage. Alright, so my closing thoughts on the Randnet technology Nintendo 64 to GameCube controller adapter. I feel like it's a pretty good product. I spent $25 on this, and that was with shipping. I think you can get them a little bit cheaper if you're willing to look. Overall, do I feel like it was worth $25? Yes and no. There are some Nintendo 64 games, and I was pointing this out in some of my audio, my gameplay footage. There are some Nintendo 64 games that just feel like they were made from the ground up on Nintendo 64 controllers. There are also some that feel like, or not feel like, that you need a memory card or you would like Rumble with. And because of that, I feel like those are the two ultimate great detractors from these. I would say if you're going to get one of these, spend between $15 to $10. Don't spend $25 like I did. Shop around a bit, see if you can get it a little bit cheaper, because $25 is pretty steep for something like this, because you're pretty much paying for a cord and a wire. It does work. Every Nintendo 64 game I tested it out with, it worked. I own about 50 Nintendo 64 games, so if it worked with all 50 of those, I'm willing to say it'll work with the entire library of games. But yeah, so the two big things, and this is why I can't recommend this, is because of the one, games that feel like they were made for Nintendo 64 controllers, and two is the lack of Rumble and save, which you know, you can't blame on a GameCube controller. It just doesn't have those ports that Nintendo 64 controllers have. So overall, I would say check this out if you can find it for cheap. If you can't find it for cheap, I wouldn't really recommend it that much. So this has been episode 2 of Controller Chaos. I would like it if you rate it, if you liked, commented, subscribed, and checked out my other videos. I'm going to keep working on videos, and hopefully by this time next week I will have the next episode up. See you later, YouTube.